Good evening, everyone. It is great to see this turnout this evening. I'm Andrew Petter, president of Simon Fraser University, and let me start by acknowledging that we are, of course, privileged to be gathered on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the President's Faculty Lecture this evening with Professor Ann Travers, who's going to speak on the topic Transgender Kids at the Crossroads, Impacts of Colonialism, Racism, and Poverty. Now, as I hope most of you know by now, we at SFU have made it our vision to be Canada's most community-engaged research university, and this President's Faculty Lecture Series is an expression of that commitment. It's part of our SFU Public Square programming, really designed to provide the community with knowledge enrichment and opportunities to engage. In this case, by giving you the privilege of hearing from some of our outstanding faculty and some of the work that they're doing and to engage with them. There will be a chance to raise questions and to offer comments after the lecture, and you're welcome to continue the conversation. We'll have a slight reception afterwards. There's some coffee and a few snacks, so feel free to stay back. Also note this lecture is being filmed, so if you do ask a question, you may end up on camera. That's both a warning and an invitation. But what we want to do is make sure that this lecture is also made available to the general public through our YouTube channel. Now, Dr. Ann Travers, let me tell you a little bit about her and why we're so lucky to hear from Ann this evening. They're an associate professor at the of sociology at Simon Fraser University. Ann's research interests include queer and transgender and trans justice, with a special emphasis on transgender children and youth, LGBT issues and movements, sport and social justice, and gender and technology. Ann's recent book, and I have it right here, The Trans Generation: How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution, situates trans kids in the white settler nations of Canada and the US, nations, sadly, that are characterized by significant social inequality. And I should just say that there are copies of the book will be for sale afterwards, and Ann very kindly has agreed to sign any books that you want to have signed, either ones you brought or ones you might want to purchase. Let me tell you a little bit more about Ann and about the book. First of all, the book. The book won the Association of American Publishers 2019 Prose Award in the category of Social Sciences, Anthropology, Criminology. Ann is also Principal Investigator on a SSHRC Insight Grant entitled Gender Vectors of the Greater Vancouver Area, Using Video Game Technology to Assess Social Safety Nets for Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Children and Youth in the Lower Mainland. In addition to a central research focus on transgender children and youth, they've published extensively on the relationship between sport and social justice, with particular emphasis on the inclusion and exclusion of women and queer and trans people of all ages. Dr. Travers was also recently recognized with an SFU Excellence in Teaching Award for providing intellectually inspiring curriculum and a supportive classroom environment. So we have someone this evening in Ann who is not only a great researcher, but a fabulous teacher, someone who has important things to say, and will talk to us tonight about transgender kids at the crossroads, impacts of colonialism, racism, and poverty. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Travers.
Thank you very much. It's so wonderful to see all of you out here tonight. It tells me that there are many people who think this is an important issue, and it's really great to see. I would like to thank President Petter for giving me the opportunity to deliver a President's Faculty Lecture. It's an incredible honor. I would also like to thank all the staff associated with the lecture series for making this evening possible. Thanks so much. I also wish to acknowledge that I am a white settler on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations. As a citizen and as a scholar, it's very important to me that I resist the erasure of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their rightful claims to the land. And I've attempted to integrate that awareness into my research on transgender kids. On an August afternoon in 2011, I found myself at a AAA baseball game in the US Southwest, standing in line at the concession stand with my daughter. When the kid in front of me turned around, she caught the involuntary look of surprise in my eyes and cheerfully called me on it. "You thought I was a boy, didn't you?" She looked like I did when I was 11, an unmistakably queer kid. She told me that she gets mistaken for a boy all the time and she's okay with it, but her mom hates her short haircut. We chatted for a bit, but when we got near to the front of the line, I switched gears and got serious. And I said to her, "I want you to remember me. Remember that I told you that someday, probably when you go to university, you're going to meet lots of people like us, and they will love you, and your life will be great." It felt deeply meaningful. I felt like I had reached across time to do for her what no one had done for me. Until later that day when I realized how elitist it was to assume that a university escape plan was in her future. Oh, wake up, PowerPoint. It's coming. All right. I identify as trans non-binary. For the past 7 years, I've been attending conferences and meetings for trans kids and their families in Canada and the United States, conducting interviews, participating in online groups, and publicly advocating for queer and trans kids, as well as LGBT people in general. This research resulted in the publication of my recent book, The Trans Generation: How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. The central argument of my book and my lecture tonight is that we need to center the most precarious trans kids in our analysis and in our social change efforts. The most precarious trans kids are some combination of Indigenous, racialized, living in poverty, disabled, undocumented. I begin tonight by outlining the importance of an intersectional analysis and focus on the shortcomings of mainstream LGBT rights campaigns. Trans kids are present in every population, whether we can see them or not. Educational scholar Mark Helen observes that the majority of trans kids are non-apparent, meaning they don't make themselves visible. They don't do this because the costs of discrimination, harassment, hostility are too high. They don't consider it to be a good exchange. So they stay hidden. And this results in the logic of the Thomas theorem. Situations that are defined as real become real in their consequences. People think there are hardly any trans kids, and that attitude keeps many hiding. Ultimately, both visible and invisible trans kids are vulnerable to high-risk behavior, self-harm, and suicide. It's important to note that this isn't because they're trans. It's because people treat trans people so badly. Trans kids represent normal and healthy gender variation and are not new, as Julie and Gil Peterson documents in their recent book, Histories of the Transgender Child. And I should know, because I was one of them. It's crucial to situate trans kids within broader relations of power and oppression. Canada and the US occupy huge, varied, and contested geopolitical spaces. Both nations brand themselves as a democracy, but each is more accurately understood as a white settler society, albeit with different histories of committing genocide against and displacing Indigenous peoples and subjugating racialized minorities. These histories provide a crucial genealogy of contemporary socioeconomic inequality and the context within which we find trans kids. I will now talk about 3 trans kids in particular, Ren, Finn, and Hunter, to emphasize the importance of paying attention to ways that varying degrees of social inequality shape the life chances of trans kids. I will then discuss problems with mainstream approaches to supporting trans kids and conclude by outlining key aspects of an anti-oppression approach to supporting trans kids. The hostility to children who are assigned male at birth but express feminine qualities is keenly felt by kids like Ren. When I first interviewed her at age 7, she told me, "I was born a boy, but I like being a girl." Ren actually wishes she had been left alone and not forced to identify as any gender. But she switched to female pronouns because the gender confusion she provoked in other people and their insistence on making it her problem was too anxiety-provoking for her. When I asked Ren about her vision of herself in the future, she was very matter-of-fact in explaining that she does not see transgender womanhood as an option. She told me of her plan to change back into a boy when she turned 10. I was a bit surprised to hear this, given how stereotypically feminine she is, although I never doubt anyone's assertions about their gender identity. When I interviewed her again at age 11, her timeline for changing back had shifted, but the vision of her future had not. She was operating in stealth mode, or invisibly. No one at her new school knows she is trans. And she now planned to change back into a boy at 14 or 15. Ren consistently refuses the possibility of trans adult for herself, explaining, "I'm Black. I don't want to be trans too." In seeing no future for herself, literally, Ren displays a sophisticated and heartbreaking understanding of the harmful effects of anti-Black racism and transphobia. Finn also saw no future for himself. Brace yourself, this is a tough story to hear. 2 years ago, I learned, via his mother's heartbreaking post on an online group for parents of trans kids, that Finn had committed suicide. I obtained permission from his mom, Heidi, to share some of what she wrote. "It's been 5 weeks since my 14-year-old transgender son, Finn, took his life. We had a discussion that night at dinner about his next hormone blocker shot and how we were going to pay for it, since we'd just gotten a letter that day about our second denial of state insurance and had been told by the drug's owner company that we were slightly over income for their patient assistance program. We couldn't afford the $1,400 a month out-of-pocket payment. He begged me to do a GoFundMe for him, but I told him we couldn't do it for something ongoing. He left the table upset. Oh, how I wish I would have checked in on him. But he spent most of his time holed up in his room, and I was trying to be respectful by not intruding. Later that night, while I slept in the next room, he quietly left the house and walked to the railroad a few blocks away and lay his body across the track. It was the 11 o'clock train. Finn found puberty too difficult to bear, and faced with what he saw as limited options for the future, chose death. I'm struck by the power of his will. This was not a call for help, but rather a grim and determined choice. Heidi agreed, saying, "I was struck by the mere determination and courage it must have taken to stay on those rails as the train roared down towards him." Heidi described Finn as gifted and wise, but lacking the maturity to manage his considerable emotional sensitivity, saying, "He had to lay down that load he was carrying somehow. The hopelessness he felt in the road ahead of him is what broke him that night." But even if he had no problem getting hormone blockers, he still had his internal demons. But if the barriers to taking the drug were not there, I don't think he would have died that night. When Hunter was attending a special education program for kids who are learning disabled, he described announcing to his class one morning that he was transgender, and his teachers responding by calling his mother to ask, as he told me, if she was accepting this. And of course, she said, I wouldn't be sending my kid to the school dressed like this or saying a different name if I wasn't accepting it. But they called her at least 3 or 4 times, like farther apart, and just kept asking the same question, but they would never say anything to my face. Hunter was understandably angry that they didn't take his word for it. But the multiple calls to his mother speak to another troubling dynamic. Hunter's mother is poor, First Nations, and a single parent, all of which make her particularly vulnerable to state surveillance, oversight, and child apprehension. That adults at Hunter's school responded to his transition by questioning his authority and that of his mother is consistent with the pervasive assumption that children lack knowledge and authority over themselves, and the Canadian assumption that Indigenous parents don't know what is best for their children. Like many trans kids, being trans is only one dimension of vulnerability for Ren, Finn, and Hunter. But lack of family support is not one of them. Family acceptance is known to be the most significant factor shaping mental health outcomes for trans kids. But the socioeconomic status of their families is key to their life chances. Activist parents of trans kids have been one of the driving forces behind the emergence of support networks for kids and families, legal and policy changes, and increasing access to affirming healthcare. Although not exclusively, and often with the support of their children's fathers, most of the parent advocacy on behalf of trans kids in Canada and the United States is engaged in by well-educated white mothers, many of whom at least appear to be heterosexual. Given the gendered nature of emotional labor in Western society in general, it's not surprising that the frontline fight has been led by women, most of whom are able to call on a degree of race and class privilege and/or the cultural capital that comes from experience engaging in other social justice struggles. Political scientist and parent of a trans kid, Kimberly Manning, explains this tendency by pointing out that more marginalized families are also struggling under the harmful effects of racism and/or poverty, and the disadvantage their trans kids experience is not confined to gender identity. However radical the more mainstream appearing activist moms of trans kids may actually be, their ability to present as non-threatening and motherly enables them to intervene on behalf of queer and trans kids in uniquely powerful ways. Now, trans and queer adults have certainly played a major role in pushing schools to be more LGBT inclusive. But the power of these so-called normal moms to challenge schools and institutions to change the way that they do sex and gender identity can't be overstated. But sometimes the challenges faced by trans kids from marginalized families can be overlooked in this process because their parents face more barriers in advocating for them. Manning observes that, quote, under the glare of the media spotlight, personal testimonials can contribute to the erasure of some trans lives. It can become easy to lose sight of the struggles of parents who may not teach at a university, for example, and of the racialized transgender kids who are at far greater risk of violence than are our own white children. Kai, a parent of a trans kid and an LGBT youth worker, addressed this reality by asking, how do we protect young people who don't have privileged activists as parents? I began writing this book in 2015 amid unprecedented, yet far from mainstream support for lesbian, gay, and transgender rights in Canada and the United States. LGBT activism had been successful in achieving significant changes in legal and policy landscapes, although more uniformly in Canada than in the United States. There are now consequences for discriminating against queer and trans people in many institutions and jurisdictions. Canada legalized same-sex marriage in 2005. Bill C-16 became law on February 14, 2017. Bill C-16 amended the Canadian Human Rights Act to include gender identity as a prohibited ground for discrimination, and the Criminal Code to make transgender people an identifiable group protected by hate speech provisions. Though many Canadians appear to feel smugly superior about Canadian inclusiveness, viewing racism and intolerance as an American rather than a Canadian problem, colonial, racist, and heteropatriarchal patterns of oppression persist as foundational components of Canadian society. While trans rights have been enshrined at the federal level in Canada and in all but 2 provinces, the current hateful shift in the political landscape of the United States, the election of right-wing governments in Ontario and Quebec, and ongoing anti-SOGI movements continue to negatively impact the life chances of trans kids. I was happy to see, however, this morning that the BC Supreme Court just ruled that parents have to recognize their children's self-determined gender identity, which is really important, and that's something that I hope will cascade across the country. In 2011, in her capacity as US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton declared that gay rights are human rights. State bans on same-sex marriage were ruled unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court in 2013. On May 9, 2016, then US Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced that the federal government was taking the North Carolina state legislature to court over HB 2, its controversial law requiring transgender people to use the bathroom corresponding to their assigned birth sex. The Obama administration followed this statement on May 13th by sending a letter to every school district in the US, directing them to allow transgender students to use the bathroom appropriate to their self-determined gender identity. This letter clearly communicated the federal government's intention to include gender identity as a protected category under the gender equity provisions of Title IX. I don't need to tell you that the 2016 US presidential election resulted in a dramatically different political landscape for vulnerable groups, LGBT people and trans kids among them. In the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, executive orders radically deepened forces of precarity for Muslim people, racialized migrants and undocumented people, people of color in general, Jews, refugees, the poor, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, women, and queer and trans people. Trump specifically targeted trans kids for persecution on February 22, 2017, when he announced that he was revoking the directive by the Obama administration to interpret gender equity provisions in Title IX to allow trans students to use bathrooms and locker rooms consistent with their gender identities. The Trump administration has reversed a number of pro-LGBT decisions of the Obama administration, including most recently the right of transgender people to serve openly in the military. Mainstream LGBT campaigns tend to focus on gender and sexual identity in isolation from other dynamics of oppression. And this is a problem because queer and trans people are not all white and relatively wealthy. The impact of colonialism, racism, and/or poverty makes some of us more vulnerable than others. Dan Savage's It Gets Better campaign, initiated in response to highly public suicides of gay teens, for example, has been criticized for speaking only to those LGBT kids who are otherwise privileged. It fails to acknowledge that for many visible minority and poor LGBT young people, it does not get better. As they grow to adulthood, they remain dogged by discrimination and poverty, continue to be vulnerable to self-harm and suicide, and are disproportionately at risk of spending time in prison. LGBT scholars and activists of color and their allies draw attention to the ongoing violence of settler colonialism, the prison industrial complex, and neoliberal restructuring, and also trouble historically inaccurate narratives of Western progress and national myths of foundational social justice that tend to be propagated by Western political leaders when they make statements in support of LGBT issues. When she announced that the federal government was filing a civil rights lawsuit against the state of North Carolina, for example, then Attorney General Loretta Lynch invoked the mythical narrative of the US as a justice-seeking country, referencing, quote, the founding ideals that have led this country haltingly but inexorably in the direction of fairness, inclusion, and equality for all Americans. Lynch noted that North Carolina's anti-trans bathroom bill harms innocent Americans. The implication is that harm remains the just desserts of the non-innocent, who we know, both historically and in current times, who are disproportionately likely to be racialized, impoverished, incarcerated, disabled, undocumented, street drug addicted, and suspected brown terrorists. In an unprecedented statement, toward the end of her announcement, Lynch spoke directly and movingly to transgender people. No matter how isolated or scared you may feel today, the Department of Justice and the entire Obama administration wants you to know that we see you, we stand with you, and we will do everything we can to protect you going forward. Please know that history is on your side. This country was founded on a promise of equal rights for all, and we have always managed to move closer to that promise, little by little, one day at a time. It may not be easy, but we'll get there together. Although such historically inaccurate statements obscure ongoing structures of oppression, they have undeniable cultural power to lessen the vulnerability experienced by some trans kids. What would we give to have a US Attorney General speak this way now? But two things are true here. It was definitely better for some trans kids under Obama, but that administration was far from heroic. And things are definitely better for some trans kids under the Trudeau government than they were under Stephen Harper. But Trudeau's loyalty to big business and resource extraction, and his government's refusal to equitably fund Indigenous children, amounts to no meaningful redistribution of wealth and power. Advances in LGBT rights in Canada and the USA have taken place at the same time that we have seen widening social inequality, the expansion of a racialized prison system, ongoing colonial relationships with Indigenous peoples, and severe cutbacks to public education and social services. These contexts continue to disproportionately increase the precarity of trans kids who are impoverished, racialized, Indigenous, disabled, and/or undocumented. Movements that focus on achieving transgender rights and changing government policies rely on legal discourse as a strategic frame and view legal and policy changes as key mechanisms for improving the life chances of transgender people of all ages. These are part of broader LGBT campaigns and typically focus on achieving two key measures. First, the inclusion of gender identity and expression as protected categories in human rights statutes, and public policies that recognize these rights by enabling transgender people to access sex-segregated facilities and sex-differentiated activities in keeping with their self-determined gender identities. And secondly, some variation on the enactment of hate crime legislation as protection from anti-trans violence. The basic rights that LGBT movements have achieved that I benefit from include freedom from discrimination and police persecution, marriage rights and/or same-sex couple benefits, and the right to adopt and retain custody of children. On a visceral level, when I stand in the dugout as a coach at a Little League game, although I experience feelings of gendered otherness quite a lot, I am still able to do so as an openly queer and gender nonconforming person. That this was not possible in the past, but is now, is not a small thing. And frankly, when I was 16, I never, ever believed this would be possible, ever. In spite of the way the attainment of rights has changed the lives of many of us, there is considerable debate among scholars and activists within trans communities about the appropriateness of prioritizing legal rights granted by the state over working collectively to oppose state and corporate power. Much of this debate mirrors that which occurred within lesbian, gay, and queer communities and scholarship about the appropriateness of same-sex marriage as a primary goal of LGBT movements. The logic of marriage equality involves gays and lesbians pushing for recognition as fully human, as respectable people, thereby qualifying us for the rights and responsibilities that go along with full citizenship. Critics argue, however, that this perspective only rehabilitates oppressive hierarchies and reinforces systems of governance that harm many people, as well as the power of the state, while normalizing private familial responsibility for social and economic welfare. In this sense, previously rejected but comparatively privileged white, middle, and upper class avowedly monogamous lesbian and gay people are, as Jasbir Puar describes it, folded into life or welcomed into the nation and accorded citizenship. Trans scholar Eric Stanley laments the, quote, normalizing force of mainstream trans politics. Assemblage theorist Jasbir Puar observes that, quote, any single axis identity politics is invariably going to coagulate around the most conservative normative construction of that identity, foreclosing the complexities of class, citizenship status, gender, nation, and perhaps most importantly, in the context of very recent events, religion, end quote. In writing about queer movements, educational scholar Kevin Kumashiro observes that a single issue focus on sexuality risks, quote, complying with other oppressions and excluding their own margins to the extent that such movements become just like the mainstream, except with different identities taking center stage. Mainstream LGBT social movements privilege queer and trans people who are white, documented, relatively wealthy, and gender conforming. Radical critiques of these movements emphasize the failure of rights-oriented measures to redistribute wealth and resources more equitably, even as they expand legal and cultural recognition. So the question is, if the rights framework has such clear limitations, to what extent then does it make sense to pursue rights for trans kids? After all, a certain degree of privilege is required for trans kids to exercise these legal rights, and the beneficiaries are disproportionately white and relatively wealthy. I'm convinced that in spite of the limits that rights have for trans kids and LGBT people in general, abandoning them would be a terrible mistake. Rights do deliver important measures of harm reduction and can be strategically important in challenging oppressive cultures. Anti-homophobia and trans-inclusion policies that recognize and value gender and sexual diversity by focusing on changing school cultures to be more inclusive, for example, do challenge oppressive aspects of heteropatriarchy and are not irrelevant, or the Christian right would not put so much time and energy into opposing them. Rights do matter because they shape cultural climate, legitimate experiences of discrimination, and provide avenues for recourse. According to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, studies have shown that LGBTQ students feel safer and more accepted when they know their schools have policies and procedures that explicitly address homophobia. School board policies that entitle students to form gay-straight alliances are also crucial, as they contribute to making schools safer for LGBTQ students. In a recent article in The Guardian, Nicola Davis reports that lesbian, gay, and bisexual students feel safer and report better mental health indicators in states where marriage equality has been achieved, as evidenced by a 14% drop in suicide attempts among queer teens in states that have legalized same-sex marriage. Bill C-16 in Canada and pro-trans announcements by the Obama administration signaled to trans people of all ages that we matter and that hatred and fear-mongering should not guide policies that concern us. The value of obtaining trans rights in shaping cultural climate for trans kids has been driven home very sharply by the damaging change in tone and policy coming from the Trump administration and the Ford government in Ontario. Rights and policy-oriented changes can and do make undeniable improvements in the lives of many trans kids that I know and care about. But these improvements rarely contribute to greater socioeconomic equality. Punishment-oriented laws and school policies, on the other hand, however, do far more harm than good. While many LGBT organizations celebrate the classification of anti-gay and anti-trans violence as a hate crime, a more critical analysis draws our attention to the way this perpetuates structural racism and classism and reinforces the power of the state to enact violence against its own citizens. Trans scholar Sarah Lamble notes that race and class privileged LGBT people's support for hate crimes legislation and harsh punishment for offenders means, quote, many LGBT communities now partly measure their citizenship status on whether the state is willing to imprison other people on their behalf, end of quote. In Canada and the US, evidence that an offense was motivated by hatred or bias towards a particular group may contribute to a tougher sentence for an individual offender. But it individualizes anti-gay and anti-trans violence and bolsters the power of the state to harm other vulnerable populations. The structural violence of heteronormativity and patriarchy remain unaddressed. This is complicated by the fact that such measures don't actually deter people from acts of violence. A prison abolitionist framework draws our attention to the fact that the employment of state repression against offenders as a measure for improving the lives of trans people reinforces the power of the state to police and incarcerate. Over the past 30 years, a phenomenal expansion of the US prison industrial complex has dovetailed with massive cuts to public institutions and programs of support for the most economically vulnerable. The state has a demonstrated record of disproportionately incarcerating Black and Indigenous people of color and poor people, among whom the most vulnerable LGBT people are to be found. And according to a 2017 report by the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law, The incarceration of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people is 3 times that for the general population in the United States. While not rivaling the United States and Russia, the 2 nations with the highest percentages of their populations behind bars, Canada's prison population is expanding fast and is equally racialized. Indigenous and Black people are disproportionately subject to incarceration. From this perspective, many trans people, kids included, have more to fear from the state than they have to look forward to with regard to protection. The issues raised by critics of hate crime measures are also at play with regard to the adoption of punishment-oriented anti-bullying policies in many school districts. Many school boards have passed anti-bullying or anti-homophobia policies that contest what has long been a normalized practice of targeting queer and gender nonconforming kids for harassment and abuse. There's no question that official statements that this kind of behavior is not appropriate is an improvement over the tacit acceptance that this was what kids should do to each other. Indeed, policies that are accompanied by adequate resources and that focus on changing school cultures and protecting vulnerable students are badly needed. Considerable research demonstrates that punitive responses to bullying, however, fail to protect vulnerable LGBT kids and instead contribute to a school-to-prison pipeline for racialized and disabled children and youth. Social work scholar Amanda Gebhard draws attention to the role of Canadian schools in placing Indigenous students, quote, on a trajectory to prison, whereby getting into trouble at school is often the first slip into the school-to-prison pipeline. This is a term coined by researchers in the United States who have been making the links between schooling and prison for several decades. The term describes systemic practices in public schooling, such as special education, discipline, and streaming programs that move poor, racialized youth out of school and place them on a pathway to prison, end quote. In the past 2 decades, many school districts in Canada and the US have adopted zero-tolerance anti-bullying policies, basically in an effort to protect themselves from legal action. Child and youth studies scholars Monique Lacarite and Zopito Marino cite the 2005 case of Jubran versus North Vancouver School District here in Canada, in which a student took his school district to court because he was subject to extreme bullying for years. The ruling assigned legal responsibility to the school district for failing to uphold its student code of conduct. Well, the case was a victory in the sense that the responsibility to protect students, to keep students safe, was placed on the shoulders of the schools. It had the unfortunate consequence of increasing the punishing capacity of schools, and this has had very negative consequences for vulnerable kids. Evidence suggests that punitive responses to bullying do not make LGBT kids safer, because rather than attending to heteronormative school cultures, they individualize anti-gay and anti-trans aggression and punish troubled kids instead of marshaling resources on their behalf. Lacarite and Marini's analysis of the zero-tolerance policy associated with Ontario's Safe School Act includes the observation that the policy, quote, outlines specific punishments for inappropriate behaviors by using suspension and expulsion more often, as well as police involvement and disciplinary measures. They go on to note that as the policy, quote, was employed more and more, expulsion and suspension rates rapidly increased, leading to another problem altogether, an increase in dropout rates, end of quote. Research establishes that Indigenous, Black, immigrant youth of color, and disabled and LGBT kids are disproportionately targeted for discipline practices that push them out of school. Such exclusion is a strong predictor of future precarity, as many of these kids do in fact drop out, remain or become poverty-stricken, and are later incarcerated. As critical childhood studies scholar Lucia Hodson observes, the criminalization of Black children is a major component of their social oppression. Strong-armed anti-bullying policies actually reinforce institutional racism by exposing more kids to criminalization, family intervention, and systems of law enforcement. And this is complicated by the fact that bullying and interpersonal violence are often multi-directional. In a 2012 report, The Health of Canada's Young People, a Mental Health Focus, the Public Health Agency of Canada noted that 33% of students who reported high involvement in bullying or victimization did so as dual participants, meaning they were bullied and they were bullying. Another study notes that students are often bullied because they are visibly poor and often resort to a violence against other vulnerable kids as a mechanism of defense. In the context of ongoing cuts to school budgets, policies that respond to student behavioral problems by allowing expulsion, however, are attractive. Educational scholars Therese Quinn and Erica Miners observe that if teaching staff are cut and those remaining are expected to meet the needs of the same number of students, there's a greater likelihood of authoritarian systems of discipline being put in place. And one of the things that research is very clear on is that authoritarian systems of discipline don't benefit anybody, any of the kids. And they're particularly harmful to kids who are already vulnerable. As I emphasized at the outset tonight, trans kids are found in every population, whether they make themselves visible or not. No discussion of trans kids' life chances in BC and Canada would be complete without talking about children living in poverty and/or in government care, among whom the most vulnerable trans kids are to be found. 1 in 5 kids in BC grow up in poverty, and Indigenous children, children of new immigrants, and visibly racialized children are disproportionately likely to be part of this 20%. This statistic also applies to Canada as a whole. 1 in 2 status First Nations children lives in poverty. 40% of Indigenous children in Canada live in poverty, and 60% of Indigenous kids on reserves live in poverty. In spite of being only 5% of children, 2/3 of the 6,500 children in government care in BC are Indigenous. And 45% of the 185 babies under 31 days old taken into care in 2018 in BC were Indigenous. In Canada, 52% of children under the age of 14 in care are Indigenous, in spite of constituting only 7.7% of the population of children. The particularly precarious position of Indigenous children in Canada reflects ongoing colonialism, intergenerational trauma from residential schooling, and the unwillingness of the federal government to fund Indigenous children to the same levels as non-Indigenous children. It's also important to note, as well, that a central aspect of colonialism in Canada and the United States has been the forceful imposition of Eurocentric binary gender and heteropatriarchal systems upon Indigenous peoples. Forces of oppression relating to racism, poverty, and colonialism combine with an imposed binary gender system to impact the life chances of some trans kids more than others. In order for social change to support all trans kids, social movements must build powerful coalitions with other marginalized communities. My kids wouldn't come, which is good. I can use this picture. I view the care work of parenting as protecting the vulnerable by definition. To use a metaphor I absolutely loathe for a moment, that of the lifeboat, I ask, how do we get all the kids into the boat? I've never felt a greater sense of purpose than I do as a parent, and I honestly fear how I might respond to a situation where there were too few resources. I might do unspeakable things to make sure that my own kids got in the boat. I probably would do whatever I could to divert scarce resources to them. But the imaginary circumstance of a boat too small to fit everyone is not inevitable. Widespread social inequality results from human action, and we have the capacity to change how things are done. Neither Ren, who is alive, nor Finn, who didn't make it, could see a future for themselves as trans people. And Hunter's situation as First Nations, living in poverty, learning disabled, and trans negatively impacts his life chances. I don't believe for a second that any of us would deny any of these kids a place in the boat. But making space for them requires a much bigger boat. And to do this, we need to work for social and economic justice for all children, to support the many vulnerable kids in our midst and the vulnerable adults that they will grow up to be. This requires establishing a baseline of security for all, not only by reversing cuts to social services, school budgets, community centers, and healthcare services, but by transforming our current national security state and its primary allegiance to global capital into an expanded welfare state. Crucial components of this model include guaranteed housing and basic income for all, fully public, not-for-profit delivery of healthcare, and equitable nation-to-nation relationships with Indigenous peoples that include concrete reparations for land theft and genocide. Thinking in terms of the most vulnerable trans kids is a powerful orientation for a vision of a more just and equitable future for all of us. The trans kids we see via mainstream and social media are typically the ones with the most support. But centering social change efforts around these kids will not produce a sufficient increase in life chances for all trans kids. So we need to do this the other way around, by focusing on increasing the life chances of the most precarious trans kids. Because if we do this, this will incorporate the gender self-determination needs of all trans kids. To support all trans kids, therefore, we need to do 4 things. First, we need to generate room for all kids to determine their own gender identities within a wider range of possibilities. Second, we need to transition environments away from the binary gender system while respecting and supporting people for whom binary identity is meaningful. 3, we need to protect trans kids without harming other kids. It's not a zero-sum game where only some kids can thrive. And 4, we should put the most precarious trans kids at the center of our social change efforts by fighting for intense social and material investment in all children via an expanded welfare state model. I find it heartbreaking that Ren sees no future for herself as a Black trans woman. But I see flashes of possibility and resilience in her. When we were talking about the difficulties involved in being different, Ren observed that these same difficulties can be gifts. When I asked her if she thinks being trans is a gift, she said, "I've heard of gifted as in magical, like a mutant. If you're transgender, you are basically kind of like a mutant. Some things are hard for you, but there are things that you can do that are amazing because you're special, like you're an X-Man." I hope that Ren will someday find a way to claim all of herself. For all I know, she will do this by coming to see herself literally as some kind of an X-man. But it's not enough for us to hope that she and other trans kids are able to find this space. We have to go beyond hope and build a big enough lifeboat for all of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for a provocative, challenging, and powerful lecture that really challenges us all to think about issues regarding trans kids in a much broader social context, to question legal rights and their role, to look at the dangers of succumbing to authoritarian impulses to try to correct problems, and ends with a call to action about social change. So there's a lot on the table. And Anne has kindly agreed to entertain some questions and comments with respect to issues on that table. And I'll do my best to try to moderate a few. And after we've had a chance to have some interaction, there will also be a chance to carry on the conversation afterwards in a less formal way. And Anne has also offered, as I say, to both sell and sign copies of this superb book. in which we can dive even deeper. So with that, if you have a comment or a question, put up your hand. We have Heather and Zoe who kindly have agreed to come around with microphones so that your voices can be heard not only by us, but also by those who watch subsequently on the video channel. So who wishes to? Right over here. Heather?
On the webpage it mentions.
Of course.
On the webpage, it mentions the gender vectors of the GVA, that video game social net. Do you have any more information you could provide about that?
Yeah, we've built a prototype of like 3 different scenes. We interviewed trans youth in the Greater Vancouver area. We also established a youth advisory council, which was absolutely crucial because the first prototype of the game was a disaster, and they told us. It was fantastic. And we thought, wow, you're so empowered. It was great. And that was just so great. We realized where, we had been missing, we weren't paying attention to certain things. So they gave us that feedback. We scrapped everything, we started over, and we got a lot more positive feedback when we piloted it recently. What we're hoping to do ultimately is get another grant, because apparently it's very expensive to build video games. Because I don't know this, but I know it now. We're hoping to get a bigger grant and develop a full version of the game and make the software available as open source to any people we like, who we feel will be using it for good. So it's happening. The project's very much ongoing, but we're going to be applying for more money to do more with it, because it's a really exciting project.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else with a comment or a question that wants to over here? Heather, if you can get over here. Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Amy Cho, and I'm the proud parent of a trans person. And I want to thank you for the work that you've done, and also thank you for focusing on Finn so much. Yeah. Thank you.
And Zoe's right behind you with the mic.
Hello, my name's Tyson Brown. My fiance and I are Indigenous, specifically Haida, so I thank you for the work you've put in here. But something that all this made me think of is, in our stories, our culture hero is Raven, or non-Kilsloss. And growing up hearing different stories involving non-Kilsloss, the idea of gender fluidity wasn't far-fetched. There was portions of stories where he would have himself be born a woman. So growing up, the idea of transgender issues wasn't too far-fetched for me. So I guess one, that just sort of a comment on it, but also, have you come across other Indigenous groups' teachings where trans issues are more normalized?
In different ways, because the various Indigenous groups wouldn't say trans in the same way, and I'm very careful not to sort of impose more Eurocentric concepts onto Indigenous people. But one of the things that I have learned is that Indigenous kids and adults who did not conform to Eurocentric binary norms were particularly persecuted, whether in residential schools or on reserves. They were often, the first to be starved, to be denied resources, to be killed, etc. So there was a real violence to the imposition of European systems. And fortunately, those cultures have been kept alive through oral traditions, but there was massive, massive effort to eliminate them on the behalf of the settler state.
Others, thanks for those questions and comments. Are there any others that people? Yeah, right up here. Wait a second, the microphone's on its way.
Hello. My name is Margaret Biswas. I was born in 1941, which is some time ago. And when I was young, I was brought up in an old-fashioned East Prussian home. My family managed to get out of Russia just before the fact of 1917. And I wished I was a boy because, I was the eldest. My father liked boys, and he always preferred my brothers no matter what I did. And that continued on until I got to university, when I met so many handsome young men and studied with them. I was the only girl in physics and with engineers, and they treated me like a princess. I made a whole career through life in a man's world, and I never experienced any sexual harassment, although I know there are some terrible men about. But there's two sides, I think, to that story. Hang up a woman's coat. If a man hangs up a woman's coat, he might be accused of more than stealing her coat.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if there's any response there. Thank you for the intervention. Any other comments or questions? Well, I think, back here. And Heather's on her way with the microphone. If you just wait 1 second. And this is, as I say, for the benefit of people who'll be listening later through the video.
Yeah, you're talking about the education and some of the consequences of bullying as structured by the institution, and I figure that I found myself a little confused on how that might be transformed, and I think it falls into that third category there. Protecting kids without harming others. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And also so that it doesn't become a process of individualizing the need for transformation?
Yeah, but I think that, a baseline of creating security for all the kids in any given group would be a good place to start. It's like, for sure, the kid from Covington who, was just so loathsome in the way that he interacted with that Indigenous elder that, that guy is overly entitled. And it's really tempting for me to want to hurt him. But I don't think it's a good idea. But the thing is that most bullies are not that guy. Most bullies are kids who are having a miserable time. Like, they're not okay. So if you turn them into criminals or you label them as bullies, then you're going to just double down on the harm that they're already experiencing, and they're not going to change their behavior. I think about, I was such a miserable kid, and I got bullied and I bullied other people. And if an adult had sort of noticed and pulled me aside and said, hey, don't do that, and had sort of brought me in, that would have worked a lot better. And I just think that we need to understand why kids are bullying other kids. For sure, some have developed have an overly developed sense of entitlement, for being white and male and all those kinds of things, which we need to target in a different way. But most of the kids who are engaged in violence or teasing of other kids are kids who are really in trouble. So what are we doing to support those kids? I think that we need to embrace those kids and provide them with resources. And there are many cultures that have restorative justice traditions that are far more effective. And it would also be a lot cheaper. Because if you do everything wrong, which we basically do as a society in terms of, child apprehension, allowing people to live in poverty, et cetera, not successfully supporting kids in schools, you are going to end up with more health issues. You're going to end up with more people living in poverty. You're going to end up with people in jail, because that's what jails do. Jails manage the problem that the society creates by not providing equitable resources in the first place. It's really expensive to run jails, and it's also a very nice for-profit industry, increasingly in Canada and the US, which explains some of the pushback against the abolition movement. But it's actually a lot cheaper to take really good care of all kids than it is the way that we're doing it right now.
So from a systemic change point of view, then, it's to try to avoid scapegoating a symptom of the greater system, perhaps.
And if you look at what happens when you apprehend a child from their family, often you apprehend a child from their family because they're poor. So you apprehend a child from this family, and let's say this family was receiving a welfare payment. They get a third a month of what you will pay to a foster family to care for that child. So we know that interrupting children's attachments with adults in their lives and other kids as well is so damaging to them. And it produces all kinds of terrible consequences down the road. So if you just, instead of that, give the people more money who are struggling to parent because of poverty, you have like a really win-win situation. But, that's clearly not what's happening right now.
Right.
And am I right?
Thank you.
Another part of your analysis, I think, that complements this was that if you legitimize authoritarian or punitive means in order to try to correct behaviors that are detrimental to trans people, more often than not, that authoritarianism and punitive consequence will be visited, in fact, on vulnerable groups, be it in the classroom or through the criminal law. So you end up legitimizing the use of state power or hierarchical power within educational institutions that in the individualized situation may look benign or positive, but in the more general situation, in fact, reinforces the very problems you're trying to correct systemically.
And within those vulnerable groups, you always find the most vulnerable trans kids, whether you know it or not. Trans kids have parents in prison because their parents were poor. Trans kids, have, they're being held after school. They're being, treated like troublemakers. They're being streamed into, programs where they're really not going to have an opportunity to develop. So I think it's really important to remember that it's really easy to fall into thinking that the queer and trans kids that we see on TV, social media, mainstream media, they're not all, but most of them are white and relatively well off. And so you think of these kids, and there's a way in which trans kids are sometimes marketed like puppies. It's like, there's a way to get people to protect them, which is a way that, tends to trivialize kids, deny them agency. But the thing is, the kids of color and the Indigenous children are not presented as puppies in need of saving, or if they are, then it justifies the whole colonial, relationship. But it's easy to think, of this nice little trans kid who is being persecuted, and if we crack down on these people, then that kid's going to be safe. But if we crack down on these people, we are cracking down on trans kids in that population. And that whole relationship of using force and punishment is incredibly harmful.
I'll take one or two more questions from anyone who hasn't asked a question yet first, and one here, and then one more, and then we'll break. Yes. And there's a microphone right on its way to you.
Hi. Is it on? Okay.
Yep.
I just want to thank you very much for really including Indigenous experience in your lecture. I find so often that it is about erasure. As a Métis woman, I find that half the time we have to sort of contextualize our experiences. So when we go to this, there's always sort of this annex that you have to add about our experiences, because there's just so much disconnection to what's happened here in this country. So I really appreciate it. I find it really refreshing. I really admire what you just did. I don't know if this is common for SFU professors, because it's been a while since
You
I've
have
been
to keep coming to lectures to find out.
Okay, but you know, I left post-secondary, you know, 2.5 decades ago, and I still remember arguing with my professors about that we were still alive, and how our experiences were different. So I really appreciate it. I hope that you're typical. No? Okay. So. I'm going to go home and, like, I follow you on Twitter, but I'm going to go home and actually look up and find out when you're teaching, and I'm going to take whatever course you're teaching, because it's
Well, that may be a great place to bring this to a close, in fact, because I think it does really summarize how I'm sure many of you are feeling and I'm feeling, which is a deep sense of appreciation to hear someone who has clearly done much work thinking through these issues and challenges us to be self-critical, as you've been self-critical, about our own structures, our own complicity. I would say, I think we at SFU are committed to trying to be an instrument for reconciliation, but there are dangers in being self-congratulatory or smug about that, or doing it in a way that discounts the intersectional dimensions, some of which we've heard about in respect of trans issues and others. And it's really important to be reminded of that fact. And tonight we've all been reminded and challenged to look at ourselves, to look at each other, to look what we can do to try to build a society through collective action that will improve lives for those who are most vulnerable. And if we do that, I think we'll improve lives for everyone. So Anne, I really want to thank you for sharing your knowledge. And I will promote the book once more if anyone wants to. I want to thank you for joining us. And there are some refreshments and a chance to continue the conversation. I also want to invite you. SFU Public Square does many things. One of the things we do every year is hold a community summit. And there's one coming up from April 10th to 18th. It's our 7th community summit. We try to focus on an issue that is important to the community. And this year, I think we've certainly hit the mark, because the issue is confronting the disinformation age. I think the challenge we all face in trying with so many sources of information to differentiate those that we can rely upon or build upon and those that we can't, about the use of disinformation and its distorting effect on society, on ability of citizens to make informed decisions, and its pernicious effects in so many different ways. And it is going to be a deep dive that's going to hopefully enable us as citizenry to better understand the issues so we can counter them. So I encourage you to go to the SFU Public Square website to check that out, and to check out all other SFU Public Square events that occur throughout the year, including future faculty lectures. The lecture series itself will start up again in the fall, and I encourage you to come back to hear other faculty members from SFU share their thoughts and knowledge. So thank you so much again for coming, and again, join me in thanking Anne Travers.